From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
Almost 2 years after President Obama signed the health care bill, his opponents want the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn it. But in state capitals nationwide, the law is already being implemented. And here in Rhode Island, it's on the fast track. Will the law hold down soaring medical bills for families, employers, and insolvent local hospitals? And when will they see results? This week on Newsmakers, the woman tasked with remaking health care in Rhode Island, Lieutenant Governor Elizabeth Roberts.
Good morning. Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm your host, Ted Nisi, filling in for my colleague, Tim White. Joining me on the panel, Eyewitness News analyst Arlene Violet and political reporter for Rhode Island Public Radio, Ian Donis. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Lieutenant Governor. Thanks for joining us on a holiday week. Appreciate it.
Great to be here.
So I want to dive right in on health care reform. As we mentioned at the top, the law is still deeply controversial. I was looking at some of the polls, and it's also not necessarily well understood yet by the public, despite all the talk. I know you support the law and think it's a good thing. Why do you think this is going to be beneficial to Rhode Islanders as all of the health care reform law rolls out?
Well, let's talk about some of the things that are already benefiting Rhode Islanders that are in this law. And you're right, we haven't won the PR battle, but there are some examples. And we were just talking about one of my daughters who is out working 2 part-time jobs, no health benefits. She's now covered on my family coverage. Up to age 26, any uninsured young person can be covered. Very inexpensive way, benefits millions of families in our country. Small businesses are now that are able to and continue to provide health insurance are now eligible and have been eligible for the last 18 months for a tax credit that pays a significant percentage.
Are you seeing people take it up?
Well, we're waiting for, it's the IRS that tracks that, so we don't have the ability at the state level to monitor that, but we talk to businesses about it frequently. Also in Medicare, there's some changes, some very positive changes that impact older Rhode Islanders. The famous donut hole in the pharmaceutical package, which said once you spent a certain amount, you then had to pay out of pocket for your pharmaceuticals. Over the next few years, that donut hole disappears. They took a big chunk out of it this year. So there are parts of this law already benefiting millions of Americans, and the more controversial parts are the ones that impact how we're going to purchase our insurance. But there are many things that are already helping everyday Rhode Islanders every day.
And I want to get to that right away. The health insurance exchanges, these are going to be online marketplaces. Some people have called it like an Amazon.com of insurance that the states or the federal government are going to run depending on how they choose to do it. You've been tasked to run the commission by Governor Chafee that's going to decide how our exchange, our marketplace works. But people are going to wonder, with the battle before the Supreme Court right now over the law, why are we working so fast to implement something that might get struck down?
Well, we're partly working fast because we need to make improvements in our healthcare system and affordability and availability of insurance. We need to get that done. If for many of us in Rhode Island, we've watched over the last 5 years that they've been doing this in Massachusetts with their connector, the Massachusetts connector, and anybody who wants to see what the exchange will be can go on, Google the Massachusetts Health Connector, and you'll get a sense of what this is going to be. There are a few exchanges already operating in our country that precede national reform. We need to improve our healthcare system. So we are moving forward. There are enormous federal resources that are being brought to our state to help us develop it. And so we are keeping moving forward because no matter what happens in the Supreme Court, Rhode Islanders, Rhode Island families, and businesses need some relief in purchasing health insurance.
Your top legislative priority for 2011 must have been this bill to set up the federal health insurance reform in Rhode Island. Governor Chafee put forward an executive order since the General Assembly didn't pass that. It bogged down in the General Assembly in a dispute over abortion. What is your explanation for why you weren't able to shepherd that bill through the General Assembly?
Well, the bill got caught, as you said, as it did in many states, around restrictions that people wanted to place that they weren't successful placing on the bill in Washington when it was originally passed. There are states throughout the country implementing the exchanges in a variety of ways. Some have executive order, some have legislation. Some are actually doing it inside government in an existing department like a Medicaid department or an insurance regulatory department without any explicit change. So there are lots of different ways that this is being dealt with.
But you have a relatively limited portfolio of official responsibilities as Lieutenant Governor. Was that a failure of leadership on your part to get that passed through the General Assembly?
I think it was an inability to come to an agreement on language that could satisfy everyone. And, you know, the House and Senate didn't agree. The governor also didn't agree. So I don't see it as a failure. I see it as a difference of opinion that will come back, I am sure, but we didn't want to be slowed down. We needed to keep moving forward.
So what exactly are the systemic obstacles to doing something about our healthcare system? You devoted your life as a legislator trying to do things in the healthcare reform area. You certainly have done it for 5 years as lieutenant governor. Yet, a recent medical society president, she wrote this doctor talking about the mess Rhode Island healthcare is. Now, usually that means there's systemic obstacles that stand in the way of reform no matter how much time anybody devotes to it. So what are those systemic obstacles that keep preventing us from moving forward?
Well, and let me tell a slightly different version. There are systemic obstacles throughout the country, and we in Rhode Island are actually in better shape and have done more than many places in the country.
But why is she
Fewer
complaining?
people,
She said things haven't changed since the mid-90s, particularly in terms of reimbursement.
Well, so there are a whole range of competing interests, and one of the biggest things we need to do as we look at health reform is what does the community need, how do we maintain and improve health, and then how do we have a sustainable system going forward. Doctors need to be able to make a living, hospitals need to be able to keep their doors open, but we also need an affordable system, and sometimes those are on a collision course. We've been able to make some real progress in Rhode Island.
But why
where
is she
we found
still
common
complaining?
ground.
She's talked about since the mid-90s. This has been her clarion call. What is Blue Cross a problem here? Are they too cheap? What's the systemic obstacles?
You know, Blue Cross is, following up with Arlene, I was looking at the numbers, there's only one other health insurer in the country that's more dominant in a single state than our Blue Cross. They cover 79%. What impact does that have? Yeah.
It has a huge impact. We have new leadership at Blue Cross, and we now have a very different board at Blue Cross than we had in the past. And I think yesterday was released their proposal for a new type of insurance for people who buy their insurance direct, don't get it through their employers. So we have in our country some real challenges where we have competing interests. What helps physicians is sometimes what is a burden for small business. And we in government are often asked to referee that very challenging situation. Where we're able to come to some success, and we're starting to see it around things like our medical home project, focus on primary care, is when we can have a common vision of how we need to move forward. If your goal is improved reimbursements alone, we're always going to have a tug of war with the employers who say to us, please don't raise my premiums. You need to figure out how do you pay differently and how do you maintain quality while managing cost. Because don't forget, this is a very personal issue. These are our kids, our parents, our husbands and wives. These are people we love who are getting care. And the last thing you want is a huge financial burden at the same time.
But after all this time, I mean, you've been at this for so many years, you must know, though, what is exactly the problem. We just went through a pension reform, and we knew what the obstacles were there. We addressed the obstacles, something got done. In healthcare, you have to know who really, despite all this balancing act, who's out of balance, that we still are having these problems that this doctor's still talking about.
The big difference in pension reform is, and you'll notice that the more complicated part we didn't deal with yet, which is where you have lots of different jurisdictions with lots of different issues at hand in the local pensions. Same thing, if we were just talking about state employees coverage, where actually we have a great success story to tell, and we've made some real improvements, there you see some real changes. But when you look at the needs of doctors, the needs of hospitals, the needs of employers, the needs of individuals who pay out of pocket, they all have some different challenges they face, and our job is to try and take some from everyone but give some back to everyone. Not simple.
The Obama administration recently moved to give states more flexibility in how they implement the federal health insurance reform. Was that mainly a concession to Republican critics of the policy, and is it a smart way to pursue the policy?
Well, I think they and what Ian's talking about is the essential benefits. There at the federal level was expected that they were going to say, here's what health insurance must include for you to sell it on an exchange with a federal subsidy. And the federal government said, actually, you at the state level are going to make that determination. And I think it was a response to a lot of criticism around the country. I won't necessarily call it partisan, about being responsive to the local market and what the needs of the local community are. I have some concern about it because I don't want to continue the inequities that we see in our country, where in some parts of the country, health insurance is much more of a protection to you and a much more serious coverage than it is in other parts of the country. But they were clearly balancing, you know, it's this history of federalism that goes back a few hundred years.
Who's going to decide that here?
In our state, that will be, I believe, the health insurance commissioner, but also we now have the exchange board has been seated, It is advisory to the governor under the executive order, but that is a community group that meets in public, and they will be discussing these issues.
We see how Republican presidential candidates are evaluated based on the strength of their opposition to the federal health insurance reform. So have Republicans succeeded in demonizing health care as a bad thing?
Well, it's interesting that there is quite a bit of rhetoric about this issue, but then you also see in many Republican states they are moving forward with implementation. And I heard a fascinating story actually recently about a Republican county in California, probably significantly larger than Rhode Island, Republican county commissioners in the majority who have created a structure to insure uninsured people in their community because they recognize the burden to them and the burden on their local providers of health care.
You mentioned hospitals earlier, and we clearly have a real problem with our community hospitals. We have Landmark in receivership in Woonsocket. We have Westerly Hospital now in receivership. You were involved, I believe, in writing the Hospital Conversions Act when you were in the Senate, and that's the law that governs how the state approves hospital mergers. I have to say, from my reporting, it appears to be a bit of a mess. Lifespan and Care New England got bogged down in huge amounts of paperwork and regulatory delays. Now the Steward merger with Landmark is running into trouble too. Both sides are very frustrated. Do you think that needs to be revisited? Do you think the law is working?
We've sent a clear message that we're open to revisiting. It's been revised once. There are some very important principles in that bill that have to do with accountability to the original mission and charitable mission of all of Rhode Island's hospitals. So I think there are some things we don't want to lose, and there's no question the intent was not to put people into 2-year-long regulatory processes. I will note that Roger Williams and Fatima, St. Joseph's Health Systems, merged in a matter of months, a year and a half ago. So it can happen, it has happened. Some of it has to do with the partners in the process as well.
21 states allow the transfer of specialties, and this has raised a major issue of incompetence among doctors. For example, a lot of dermatologists are leaving that profession. They're doing plastic surgery without necessarily the background. Do you see that as a potential problem in Rhode Island, and should there be regulations in place that when people leave a specific specialty that they had to move on an attenuated specialty, that we need some regulations in that area?
Well, we have a Board of Medical Licensure and Discipline which oversees, licenses and oversees the practice of doctors in our state. And absolutely, if doctors are practicing outside of their expertise.
Well, the issue is the regulations.
Right.
So, I mean, they can practice
right. They
because
have a
there
license.
aren't regulations.
Right. And that has been the case with most professional licenses, that the state itself doesn't set, it relies on the profession. But we have a fairly rigorous board, and it is half public members. It is not all physician members. And it's up to them to make recommendations if we want to change those regulations going forward.
Quickly, I want to ask you, are you worried about Medicaid cuts, further Medicaid cuts in the next budget process coming up?
What I'm hopeful for and what we're seeing is reform that will change the costs in our in our Medicaid program, which we need. It's an unsustainable program in every state in the country right now as it eats up more and more of the state budget. My goal is that we make those budget cuts through reform rather than strict cuts of eligibility or reimbursement. Because when we talk about physicians and other types of providers, they will not see our Medicaid patients if we don't pay them adequately. But we can look at providing care in different sites at lower costs. There's lots of things we can do. Focus on primary care in our Medicaid program, and we can bring down costs that way.
Do you think that message is getting across at Smith Hill?
I think it is. I think it is, unfortunately with budget cycles, it is sometimes quicker to cut than it is to reform, but we have some major reforms ongoing, particularly in long-term care, which is where the bulk of our Medicaid program is spent, actually in disabled services and long-term care.
We have to take a break. Coming up next, we'll ask our guest, Lieutenant Governor Elizabeth Roberts, about her own political future. You're watching Newsmakers. Stick with us. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Ted Nesi, filling in for Tim White. To my right, Eyewitness News analyst Arlene Violet and Rhode Island Public Radio's Ian Donis. Our guest this week is Lieutenant Governor Elizabeth Roberts. Ian.
2011 was a tough year for Governor Chafee. If you look at his most recent approval rating in a Brown University poll, it put it at 27%. Do you think the governor deserves a higher rating for that, rating for his job performance? And could you envision a situation if he runs for re-election in which you would oppose him?
So let's take those questions separately. I think he does deserve a higher rating. I think there is a lot that's been accomplished, but I think there has been a loss in kind of focused message and how those things have come across. But when you look at some of the real successes, you look at the talent in this cabinet, Actually, I give the governor a lot of credit for a lot of the very good appointments he's made. You know, but it's a tough world right now, and Rhode Islanders are hurting, and the governor is the head of the state and bears the brunt of that unhappiness right now.
So how about the
second half?
The second. You know, I do not see a scenario. I enjoy a very strong working partnership with this governor, as I do. I think you see a group of general officers right now who are working very well together, and the people deserve that. We have a 4-year term for a reason, so that we can work collaboratively on challenging issues. You saw it with the pension. You see a different group of us working on health care. I work with the Attorney General. So we need to keep working on that and not focusing on our
You're saying you would
futures.
not run against Chafee?
I do not see a scenario where I would run against
You've been relatively silent on the recent pension reform. Do you support the recent passage of pension reform that finally emanated out of the General Assembly? Do you think that's right?
I do, and
Yeah.
I publicly said it. I was not one of the people who was making the headlines, because it's not really something that people look to me for leadership on, but I very publicly spoke up on behalf of the treasurer's work and in public meetings with her. But also, you know, one of the great things I think the public saw here was the heads of both the Senate and the House, the governor and the treasurer, working together. I agree with them all that the local pensions, absolutely imperative that we take that on.
Some people might not think that, but of course you're a statewide elected official, so there's lots of people that think all the general officers should comment on matters of such import. But Gina Raimondo obviously has become the politician, at least du jour, during 2011. You've made no secret about your wanting to be governor someday, your term limited. Do you feel, though, she has eclipsed you, in a sense, as the leading woman politician in the state? And to what degree would you challenge her in a primary?
I do not at all feel eclipsed, and one of the great things right now is we have our areas of expertise, we have great collaborative working relationships, and I do not see a scenario where I see us as partners, not rivals, and she and I work very closely together in that way.
If she announced for governor, would you then potentially stay out of a primary?
You know, it's 2 or 3 years from now, and I think we need to focus on working well together. She and I talk frequently. There's no way that we would surprise each other as that went forward.
I have a different question, but I have to ask quickly, following up on Arlene. Do you think Lincoln Chafee should join the Democratic Party?
You know, Lincoln Chafee is Lincoln Chafee. He is an independent. He is an independent man, as the independent man is right here behind me. That is something that he needs to make a decision about it.
Would
And
you
I think
welcome
he
him?
has reached, you know, I welcome working with him. I am somebody who is a Democrat, but work across any line that I need to reach across in order to get work done.
Well, a line that was tough to cross was with Governor John Kachiri. Your office had a famously somewhat frosty relationship with his. It's obviously very different now with Governor Chafee. You seem much more closely involved in what's going on in the governor's office. Can you sort of explain, has your job changed with the new arrival of a new administration?
Absolutely. And you are correct that we did never worked out a real collaborative partnership in the prior administration. And the governor, before he took office, made it very clear that he wanted to have a partnership, and I accepted that extended hand, and we have worked very closely on health issues very publicly, but also on emergency management, where I was involved, for example, in the recent search for the new Rhode Island EMA director. So I am included in many of the cabinet discussions and meetings, and it's a very strong working relationship at the staff level as well as at the senior level.
The same-sex
elected
marriage issue must hit close to home for you, because your spokeswoman, Maria Taco, not as a representative of your office, but as a private citizen, testified in support of the same-sex marriage bill during legislative hearings in 2011. Is it acceptable to you that Speaker Fox and Senate President Pavel say they have no interest in passing the same-sex marriage bill in 2012?
I will continue to speak out and advocate for marriage equality in our state, and as I have on other issues throughout my career that I felt strongly about, and it is only by people speaking out and continuing to push this forward that we will come to a resolution, and I hope a resolution where we recognize equality.
This is, again, another issue of how you perceive your role as a statewide elected person as opposed to the traditional concept of lieutenant governor. But as you know, there's talk about a full-fledged casino, particularly at Twin River. A, do you support the referendum? And B, you've been in public office a long time. Do you have a personal opinion now as to whether we should go to a full-scale casino in order to at least compete with Massachusetts?
So I have very publicly in the past been an opponent of casino gambling. If we had spent as much time on other types of economic development and growth as we have on casino gambling over the last 15 years, we would not have
So you're still
the unemployment
opposed?
rate.
You're still
I have a
opposed?
real problem with it. I don't think we win that battle. But I am not going, if it goes back to the voters, of course the voters will have their say. I do not believe it is a good approach to economic growth in our state.
Should the voters get the say? 2006 was the last referendum.
It's absolutely, it's the
support-
way it is created under our constitutional structure that the voters have that say, both in the community where it would be located as well as statewide. So I certainly will support that as it's under the state law.
Going back to politics, when I started telling people you were our guest this week, after saying I was excited to have a wonky discussion of healthcare, everyone in politics I mentioned said, what are her future plans? What's she going to do after 2014? You're term limited in this office. As you said, you probably won't be running for governor against whether it's Chafee or Raimondo that year. As a Democrat, a lot of the paths forward are blocked by fellow Democrats because we're in Rhode Island. What's your future after 2014? Are you going to run for something else? Do you have your eye on maybe mayor of Cranston or something unexpected?
So my commitment is to public service, and it doesn't have to be through elected office. And I will, I am very much, if you look at the timeline of what we began our conversation about here today, which is healthcare, that law needs to be implemented just about the day I leave office. And that will take as much attention and time and energy as I have to commit to it, and I plan to commit to it. So I will then, certainly like all of us, I think about what comes next. But my commitment is to public service, not necessarily elected.
It sounds right now you're exiting out the door. That's your,
We
where
will
you're
see.
leaning.
We will see. Yeah, as you know, Arlene, things change in politics all the time.
How do you respond to the critique from people like Bob Coolmoose Healy that the lieutenant governor's office is a waste of $1 million? And what would you point to as accomplishments in saying that we really do need a lieutenant governor's office here in Rhode Island besides the health insurance exchange?
So actually, I will point to the health insurance exchange right now, because what you see, and it's not often Rhode Island is number one. We are the only state in the country at this point that has received the federal support at the next level of exchange development. And that is because we created a structure that is coordinating activities both inside and outside government. My office is leading that effort. And if you look at the investment in my office, and that there's $58 million that just came in the door, in addition to other resources that are coming in, you can look at the cost benefit. But I will also say, look at the benefit that we will have long term, and the small businesses that we're working directly with on health issues as well as other issues. These are basic economic issues, and they're also issues about making government work. And this administration is showing what a partnership this office can be and what a role it can play.
Do you think it would be better if the governor and lieutenant governor ran together on the same ticket?
The constant question, and one that there are pros and cons in every approach.
But we see it right here with your relationship with Carcieri versus Chafee.
Correct. We're not elected together, and one of the worst relationships in recent time, and he won't mind if I say it because they patched it up, was Bruce Sumlin and Roger Beejan, both elected as Democrats. And then you need to consider, one of my big issues is I feel there needs to be an accountability to the voter. So, for example, in Massachusetts, our neighbor to the north, you run in primaries, and you are put together in a partnership. And those of us who have been in elected office know that those are not always good relationships either. So a lot of this has to do with how you do your job, and are you able to work out a good working relationship, party or no party.
Excuse me. As a Democrat leader, do you support Cicilline as a congressman, and did you think that he did misrepresent the state of the finances in Providence?
I do support the congressman. I very much understand that the situation in Providence when Mayor Taveras walked in was more challenging than he expected. I also know that in government there are times when some information is available and other is not. I cannot believe he knowingly misrepresented the public. I think that things changed rapidly, and we are now statewide and citywide dealing with the consequences.
As a former state senator, what's your reaction to the large number of lawmakers in 2011 who were either arrested, indicted, or reported to be under investigation? What message does that tell us about the General Assembly?
Well, I think for all of us in elected office, it's very disheartening to see people who have difficulty, who deserve the public's trust, and then violate the law. I mean, and you see it with the police chief in North Providence right now. We need to meet the very highest standards as elected officials and as people serving the public, whatever our role. And I am always deeply disappointed when that doesn't happen, as the public is.
We're running low on time, but I have to ask, after the holiday tree brouhaha this month, I noticed you were asked to preside over the menorah lighting at the State House. The menorah is a religious icon, and you're not of Jewish faith, I don't believe. Who asked you to preside over it? Did you have any qualms about that with everything else?
I didn't. I mean, I really believe that the State House is a place where we kind of make a very broad tent for the people, the cultures, the traditions of our state. And if you're in the State House right now and you see the decorations that are created representing heritages from throughout the world of people who now live in Rhode Island, and you see them for Christmas, you see them for Hanukkah, you see them from Eastern Europe, from South America, from Asia, I had no problem standing there and representing it.
Should have been the Christmas tree, not the holiday tree.
Quickly.
It should have been a recognition of everyone.
Christmas tree or holiday tree?
It is a Christmas tree in my home.
All right,
but this is the State House.
We'll have to leave it on that seasonal note. That's all we have time for this week. I want to thank our guest, Lieutenant Governor Elizabeth Roberts. Remember, you can catch every episode of Newsmakers on our website, WPRI.com. Just click on air. From all of us at Eyewitness News, we wish you a very happy New Year. We'll be back next week. See you then.